From the moment I moved into the quiet suburban enclave, I knew I would clash with someone, though I never imagined it would be Karen. She had perfected the art of neighborhood policing, a sharp eye for anything out of place, a phone always ready to document violations, and a voice that carried across the cul-de-sac like a warning siren. My trucks, big, bold, and functional, were the first target. They weren't flashy or extravagant, just work vehicles, covered in dust from long days hauling materials for my side business. But Karen saw them as a threat, a blemish on the pristine image she believed the neighborhood demanded. At first, I tried ignoring her. I thought if I kept my trucks parked neatly, maintained them, and followed the rules as they were written, she would lose interest. But Karen had an uncanny ability to escalate everything. One morning, she appeared at my door holding a printed list of alleged violations, with my trucks circled in red marker as if they were the spawn of some suburban apocalypse. She claimed they lowered property values, disrupted the aesthetic harmony of our community, and frankly, she made it sound as though the mere sight of my vehicles was a crime against humanity. I laughed at first, assuming the HOA would see reason. After all, the rules about vehicle sizes were vague at best. I kept a record of my trucks, noted their legal classification, even gathered receipts showing they were registered properly. But Karen wasn't interested in reason. She spent weeks attending HOA meetings, bringing petitions, rallying a small but vocal group of homeowners who were either convinced or terrified of her charisma. She painted me as a menace, a person who refused to conform, who would stop at nothing to undermine neighborhood order. The HOA, usually slow, moving, and indifferent, suddenly seemed to be listening. Notices began appearing on my door, citing vague infractions. Each one felt like a paper dagger, and every day the tension mounted. I realized Karen had weaponized bureaucracy, turning the HOA into an extension of her personal vendetta. Then, one morning, I came home to find the final notice. My trucks were now officially banned from being parked on any street or driveway visible from the common areas. Overnight, my trucks, which I had parked legally and maintained meticulously, became pariahs. The HOA had sided with Karen entirely, and the feeling of injustice hit me like a sledgehammer. I stared at my vehicles, gleaming in the morning sun, knowing I could not simply surrender. This wasn't about trucks anymore, it was about principle. I began to research, poring over property records, easements, and local ordinances. That's when I discovered something the HOA and Karen had overlooked. The very road she used every day, the one she bragged about maintaining and policing like her personal kingdom, sat partly on an easement that ran through my property. Legally, I had rights that far exceeded her whining or the HOA arbitrary rulings. My mind raced as I imagined the possibilities. I wasn't going to fight fire with fire. I was going to fight bureaucracy with legality, leverage with leverage, and if necessary, show Karen the consequences of crossing the wrong neighbor. The next few days were spent quietly, almost secretly, mapping the road, documenting its path across my land, and consulting with attorneys about what actions I could take that would be fully legal, fully enforceable, and utterly humiliating to the self-righteous Karen who had tormented me for months. The idea took shape in my mind with crystal clarity. I would not only regain my dignity, but I would do so in a way that left no doubt about the extent of my rights. Karen had forced the HOA to ban my trucks. I would force the law to recognize the truth of property ownership and easements, and she would learn that no amount of whining could undo real legal authority. By the end of the week, everything was ready. I had the documentation, the lawyer's advice, and a plan that was precise and unassailable. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and I felt a mix of anticipation, satisfaction, and a certain guilty thrill. The trucks that had been banished would be avenged, not with anger, not with retaliation, but with the undeniable power of the law executed perfectly. The calm before the storm was palpable, and as I stood on my porch, watching Karen drive her usual route along the road, oblivious to what was coming, I knew the next chapter of this suburban saga would be unforgettable. The morning after my preparations were complete, the neighborhood felt unusually still, as though the air itself sensed the quiet shift in power that was about to unfold. I went about my routine with deliberate calm, knowing that beneath the surface of normalcy lay the foundation of a response Karen would never forget. While she strutted around the neighborhood, sipping her oversized iced coffee and scanning for imaginary violations, I finalized the last of the legal filings confirming my rights over the easement cutting through the community road. The attorney I had consulted was efficient, meticulous, and more than a little amused by the absurdity of the situation. Still, he respected the legitimacy of my claim and ensured every document bore the exact phrasing needed to make the whole operation airtight. No loopholes, no misinterpretations, no wiggle room for Karen or the HOA to twist the narrative. It was all in black and white. I owned the easement, I controlled usage rights, and anyone driving on that segment of the road, including Karen, was subject to my terms. As I reviewed the stamped paperwork in my kitchen that morning, a slow burn of satisfaction spread through me. All of Karen's plotting, her theatrics, her underhanded lobbying with the HOA, every one of her efforts had unknowingly pushed her directly into the jaws of the very trap she'd helped set. Her obsession with control had blinded her to the fact that the road she used daily wasn't hers to weaponize. She had spent months trying to get me off the streets. Now she was about to find out she had been driving on my property all along. First step of my plan was simple: signage, not aggressive, not hostile, just factual, professionally printed signs declaring the easement a private access strip and specifying that unauthorized or non-compliant vehicles would be subject to towing. The wording came straight from the legal recommendations, every phrase intentionally chosen to be enforceable. I had them installed at dawn, exactly on the boundary lines noted in the property records. By the time the sun fully crested the rooftops, the signs stood tall and undeniable, their metallic sheen catching the light like beacons of impending chaos. It didn't take long for the rumblings to begin. Neighbors who usually ignored anything short of fireworks suddenly gathered on the sidewalk, murmuring as they stared at the signs. Phones came out, pictures were taken, the neighborhood group chat, usually flooded with lost pet posts and yard sale announcements, erupted with speculation. Some wondered if it was a prank. Others feared new construction. A few, the more perceptive ones, connected the dots between my recent truck ban and the unusual legal verbiage on the signs. Karen, however, slept later than most, designing her mornings around leisure rather than productivity. She didn't see the signs until nearly an hour after they went up, and I was almost disappointed I hadn't been there to witness the initial shock. But I didn't need to be present. Her reaction announced itself to the entire block. The sound of her brakes screeching to a halt at the sight of the first sign echoed through the cul-de-sac. Her voice, sharp, indignant, incredulous, bounced off the quiet houses, demanding explanations from anyone within earshot. I watched from my window as she gestured wildly, talking at the signs as though yelling could change steel and ink. Her disbelief quickly morphed into fury, but fury wasn't a strategy, and yelling wasn't a legal argument. The HOA president arrived shortly after, alerted by a barrage of frantic texts from Karen. He approached the signs with a clipboard in hand, adjusting his glasses with the nervous energy of someone caught between two forces he couldn't control. I stepped outside then, calm and collected, my paperwork in a neat folder. The HOA president tried to assert some manufactured authority, asking why I had installed signs without HOA approval. I responded by handing him the documents, letting him read the lines that spelled out, in language even Karen couldn't twist, that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the easement. His expression shifted slowly from irritation to confusion to reluctant acceptance. He knew he had no footing here. Karen, however, refused to acknowledge defeat. She demanded the signs be taken down immediately, shouting about community order, aesthetic harmony, and the integrity of the neighborhood. But none of her arguments mattered anymore. The law was clear, my rights were documented, her voice, and the HOA influence had finally hit a boundary they couldn't bulldoze. By midday, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. Some homeowners whispered about the implications. Others smirked, quietly thrilled to see Karen's power waver. A few even approached me privately, thanking me for standing up to her tyranny. It surprised me how many people felt suffocated by her constant policing. How many had endured her unsolicited guidance on everything from paint colors to mailbox shapes. I had become an accidental hero in a suburban rebellion I hadn't realized was brewing, But this wasn't about heroism. It was about justice. It was about balance. It was about finally showing Karen that the world didn't bend to her will simply because she screamed louder than everyone else. With the signs in place and the legality established, the next step was enforcement. And enforcement came naturally when Karen crossed the line, literally and figuratively. Despite the warnings, despite the documentation, despite the HOA president's quiet admission that she needed to comply, Karen refused. She declared loudly that she would not change her routine, would not alter her path, and would not acknowledge any rule that didn't originate from her or the HOA. That afternoon, as she drove home, she passed the signs again, this time not slowing down, not hesitating, defiantly rolling over the easement like nothing had changed. Except everything had changed. I watched her car roll across my property as though the asphalt belonged to her. That moment wasn't an accident, it was a choice that triggered the next phase of my plan. I contacted the towing company that my attorney had recommended specifically, one known for its precision and professionalism in legally complex situations. I presented them with the documentation. They confirmed everything, the easement, the signage, the violation. Within an hour, a tow truck rolled quietly into the neighborhood, subtle but not inconspicuous. It backed into position with the kind of deliberate movements that draw eyes like magnets. Neighbors emerged from their homes, curiosity piqued. Some filmed, some gasped, some whispered excitedly. And there, parked illegally on my easement, was Karen's beloved car, pristine, polished, undeniably out of place. The tow operator wasted no time. Chains clinked. The truck's hydraulic lift hummed. Karen's car tilted upward in a slow, poetic arc that felt like justice made visible. I didn't gloat. I didn't boast. I didn't even smile. I simply observed, calm and steady, as the car was secured and hauled away. Karen, hearing the commotion, burst from her front door with a scream that rattled the windows. She sprinted toward the tow truck, shouting threats, accusations, and declarations of imagined authority. But nothing she said mattered. The operator, shielded by the legality of our agreement, continued without flinching. The car disappeared around the corner, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the street, trembling with fury and shock. Her reign of control had been broken, not by chaos, not by confrontation, but by the very thing she claimed to respect, rules. Real rules, legal rules, rules she could not manipulate. As the crowd dispersed and the echoes of her shouting faded, I returned to my home, the weight of months of frustration finally lifting. Yet beneath that relief, I sensed the shift in the air. Karen was wounded, furious, and humiliated, and humiliation has a way of igniting desperation. I knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the turning point. The battle she had started was entering a new phase, one where she would fight not with rules, but with whatever chaotic force she could muster in the face of her crumbling influence, and I was ready for it. Because, while she had underestimated the power of law, she was about to underestimate something even more dangerous. A neighbor who had nothing left to lose and every right to enforce. The next chapter of this war wasn't just inevitable, it was already unfolding. The day after Karen's car was towed, the neighborhood was abuzz in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. People whispered behind curtains, pointed subtly as they passed, and speculated on what could possibly come next. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation, as though the very streets themselves were holding their breath for the next act in this unfolding suburban drama. Karen, predictably, did not retreat into quiet reflection. She prowled her property like a wounded animal, her fury barely contained beneath layers of forced composure. From her windows, she glared at my trucks parked legally in my driveway, the very trucks she had spent months campaigning against. Her indignation radiated outward, seeping into the minds of neighbors and making casual interactions increasingly awkward. I observed her from a distance, noting every erratic movement, every pointed glance. The neighborhood had become a stage, and she was performing a show of escalating desperation, while I quietly maintained control over the plot. By mid-morning, I received my first real wave of repercussions, messages from the HOA. The president, brow furrowed and voice hesitant over the phone, tried to sound authoritative, but the panic was evident. Karen had flooded them with complaints, emails, and phone calls, demanding immediate action. She claimed harassment, intimidation, and a litany of grievances that seemed to grow with every retelling. I listened patiently, letting the calls filter through, understanding fully that their flustered tone was validation of my position rather than a threat. They had no legal footing here. My easement, my signage, my towing, all perfectly legitimate, all perfectly enforceable. Karen's influence had been diminished, at least temporarily, and that was evident in the flustered way the HOA scrambled to respond. The next few days were a study in psychological warfare. Karen did everything she could to regain control. She spoke to neighbors in hushed tones, attempting to poison the well with tales of imagined slights and violations. Flyers appeared on doorsteps outlining the dangers of unchecked property aggression, and subtly hinting at my supposed misconduct. She tried to rally support at HOA meetings, presenting herself as a victim of intimidation, a guardian of the neighborhood's moral compass. Yet each attempt faltered. Her credibility had been shattered by her own obstinance and the visible demonstration of her car being towed from my easement. People were watching now, not just her but me, and in every subtle glance, every whispered conversation, there was an acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. I did not gloat openly. Instead, I maintained a quiet presence, my trucks parked obediently within the rules, my paperwork in order, and my signs a permanent reminder of my legal authority. Karen's increasingly erratic behavior only solidified my control. One afternoon, I observed her attempting to photograph my property from over the hedge, snapping pictures of trucks and signs, as if to create a dossier of violations that did not exist. She scurried back to her house each time she heard a car approach, eyes darting nervously, hands trembling with frustration. It was almost poetic. The once dominant force of the neighborhood reduced to furtive surveillance and impotent rage. But this was just the beginning. Karen, as it turned out, was far from defeated. She had begun exploring the limits of legal retaliation herself, contacting attorneys and threatening lawsuits over alleged harassment. The irony was not lost on me. Every move she made only highlighted how completely she misunderstood the scope of the easement and my rights. She could threaten, file, and accuse all she wanted, but the law had no loopholes for those who ignored property records. Meanwhile, I prepared quietly for the next stage. If Karen believed the towing of her car was a one-off incident, she was gravely mistaken. I began drafting a full plan to reinforce my control over the easement. Cameras were installed, discreet yet comprehensive, capturing every vehicle that entered my domain. Notifications were set up with the towing company, so any unauthorized vehicle could be removed swiftly, legally, and without ambiguity. The process was methodical, deliberate, and entirely within the law. My goal was not chaos for its own sake, but unassailable authority that could withstand even the most frantic complaints from Karen or her allies. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had entered a kind of uneasy equilibrium. Karen drove more cautiously, though still defiantly, aware now that the consequences of her actions were immediate and tangible. I had become a figure of quiet power, a subtle but undeniable force that no one could challenge without risking exposure to legal repercussions. It was in this period of calm that I noticed a new layer of strategy emerging. Karen was attempting to manipulate community perception, emphasizing my aggressive enforcement of property rights while minimizing her own provocations. Flyers, social media posts, and whispered rumors painted me as the villain, a dangerous neighbor who took petty disputes to extreme lengths. It was a sophisticated psychological gambit, and one I anticipated. I had not only prepared legally but also psychologically, understanding that perception could be as potent as law in a community like ours. I responded by reinforcing transparency. Notifications to neighbors about towing procedures, copies of easement documents, and open explanations about the legal basis for all actions were distributed carefully. No confrontation, no insults, just clarity. Slowly, the narrative shifted. People could see, understand, and verify the legitimacy of my actions. Karen's manipulations began to falter as neighbors compared her claims to the documented reality. The tipping point came one weekend morning when she attempted to block my driveway with her personal vehicle. an act intended to provoke or intimidate. She parked with precision, ensuring maximum visibility, and waited, presumably, for a confrontation. I watched from the house, unmoved, knowing that this was exactly the type of situation for which my legal arrangements had been prepared. The tow truck was already scheduled, the cameras recording every angle. When she emerged from her house, waving and shouting, the truck operator calmly drove up, chains ready. Karen's face, once composed and self-assured, crumpled in disbelief as her vehicle was once again lifted from the ground, secured, and removed. The crowd of neighbors drawn by the spectacle witnessed first, and the consequences of her defiance. Gasps, murmurs, and quiet applause rippled through the street. The psychological impact on Karen was immediate and severe. Her confidence shattered, her usual bravado replaced by panic and rage. In that moment, it became clear that the dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted permanently. I was no longer just a neighbor with trucks parked legally. I was the authority, the enforcement mechanism, and the visible reminder that rules, real rules, trumped personal vendettas. Karen retreated, furious but powerless. Over the following days, she attempted to regroup, exploring other avenues to challenge me. She filed complaints, contacted attorneys, and even tried to manipulate sympathetic neighbors to her cause. Yet each effort was met with the unyielding structure I had established: documented legal authority, visible enforcement, and transparency that left no room for misinterpretation. Slowly, the neighborhood began to accept the new status quo. People approached me with quiet words of support, acknowledging the courage and precision required to maintain control in the face of Karen's relentless aggression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the tide had clearly turned. Karen's influence waned as reality clashed with her constructed narrative. By the end of the chapter, the streets were quiet again, though the tension remained, a lingering sense that the next confrontation could erupt at any moment. Karen's determination, tempered by humiliation, had not vanished. She was planning, plotting, and preparing her next move. I, however, remained calm, steady, and legally fortified, aware that the battle was far from over but confident in the position I had meticulously built. The neighborhood had witnessed the power of lawful authority, and Karen had experienced the consequences of relentless defiance. As I stood on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops, I understood that the unfolding war was not about trucks, signs, or even towing. It was about control, principle, and the unassailable assertion of rights that no amount of shouting, whining, or bureaucratic manipulation could overturn. And with that, the stage was set for the next escalation, a chapter that promised more confrontation, more strategy, and more dramatic consequences for the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac. The weeks that followed the second towing incident brought an uneasy calm to the neighborhood. Calm is never permanent when Karen is involved. Her defeat had been public, undeniable, and humiliating, yet she refused to disappear quietly into the background. Instead, she shifted tactics, moving from overt defiance to a subtler, more insidious form of aggression. The first signs were small: passive-aggressive notes left on neighbors' doors, carefully phrased complaints about disturbing activity, and unlawful interference with community standards. She attempted to rewrite the narrative, portraying herself as the victim of harassment while framing my actions as aggressive overreach. Yet the foundation I had established was strong. My signage remained legal, the easement documents unassailable, and the tow notifications thorough and transparent. Each time Karen attempted to manipulate perception, I countered with evidence and clarity. Cameras captured every vehicle entering the easement. Every towing action was meticulously documented and backed by legal paperwork. Her complaints fell on ears increasingly attuned to the facts. Meanwhile, I observed subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamics. Neighbors who had previously hesitated to speak now approached me with quiet words of acknowledgement or support. Some whispered their admiration for the precision with which I had handled Karen. Others confided that they had long endured her policing and were relieved to see her authority challenged. It was a peculiar feeling to wield power not through intimidation, but through legality and calm, deliberate action. Karen, of course, noticed. Her vigilance intensified. She prowled the streets, camera in hand, attempting to capture infractions that did not exist. She documented every minor movement, hoping for something that could be construed as a violation, a technicality to leverage against me. But every attempt failed, and the futility only deepened her frustration. One evening, I noticed her lingering near the easement boundary, notebook in hand, sketching lines, recording measurements, and muttering to herself. It was an intense, almost obsessive study, as though she believed she could rewrite reality through calculation and persistence alone. But property lines are not subject to emotion, and the law does not bend to wishful thinking. Still, Karen's behavior signaled a shift. Her focus was no longer casual or reactive. It had become strategic. I realized I needed to anticipate her moves rather than merely respond. That weekend, she took her campaign to the HOA meeting, a forum she had once dominated effortlessly. This time, however, her energy was met with quiet resistance. Neighbors had grown tired of her theatrics. They questioned her credibility, doubted the validity of her claims, and in subtle ways expressed their preference for compliance with the legal boundaries I had established. The HOA president, already wary from previous incidents, intervened when she attempted to escalate, reminding her that the easement and related signage were legally enforceable and that my actions had been fully documented and communicated. Karen's fury was palpable. The meeting ended abruptly with her storming out, leaving behind a trail of whispered speculation and glances from neighbors who were more curious than sympathetic. In the days that followed, I anticipated retaliation. Karen's temper, coupled with her obsession with control, suggested she would not relent quietly. Sure enough, small incidents began to accumulate. I found objects placed near the trucks, minor vandalism attempts, and even anonymous letters left in my mailbox implying threats if I continued enforcing my rights. I treated each incident with methodical calm. Security cameras recorded everything. I reported harassment where necessary. I remained entirely within the law, documenting meticulously while maintaining composure that contrasted sharply with Karen's escalating panic and rage. One afternoon, I observed her attempting to block access to the easement with a strategically placed dumpster, clearly hoping to provoke a confrontation or legal complaint. I called the towing company in advance, just as a precaution, and documented the placement carefully. When the dumpster became a legal violation, I coordinated its removal swiftly. Neighbors watched, some with quiet amusement, as Karen realized that her manipulations had been anticipated and neutralized. The psychological impact of these repeated failures was visible. She paced her property, muttered at passing cars, and engaged in endless phone calls. Her influence had waned, and she knew it. Yet I recognized a new pattern forming: desperation. Desperation often leads to mistakes, and in Karen's case, those mistakes were already emerging. She began to overextend herself, contacting media outlets, misrepresenting facts, and attempting to involve city officials in matters that were purely private property disputes. I maintained careful records of each interaction, aware that her overreach could easily backfire. Each misstep made her case weaker, each exaggeration more transparent to those she hoped to sway. In the meantime, I continued to reinforce my control. I added additional signage along the easement, subtle but unmistakable, clarifying the rules and consequences for noncompliance. I coordinated with the towing company to establish rapid response procedures for any future infractions. Cameras were upgraded for clarity and coverage. Every step was deliberate, professional, and entirely within my legal rights. By this point, the psychological tension in the neighborhood was almost tangible. Karen's energy dominated every conversation she attempted to influence. She whispered, cajoled, and complained, yet her words increasingly fell on deaf ears. Neighbors had begun to recognize that the conflict was no longer between trucks and aesthetics. It was about Karen's inability to accept limits. The next escalation came unexpectedly. A neighbor who had remained neutral, quietly observing from a distance, approached me with information about Karen's latest maneuver. She had attempted to file a restraining order, claiming that my enforcement actions constituted harassment. I reviewed the paperwork carefully, noting every flaw and exaggeration. Her claims were baseless, her evidence circumstantial at best. I submitted counter evidence, records of towing notices, documentation of the easement, and photographic proof of signage and compliance. The restraining order was denied almost immediately, a decision that reinforced the legal framework supporting my actions and further eroded Karen's credibility. Publicly, her frustration was visible but contained. Privately, I knew she was spiraling. Her attempts to manipulate neighbors, the HOA, and local authorities were failing repeatedly. Every failure was a blow to her perceived authority, a reminder that control cannot be imposed through volume, anger, or intimidation alone. It had to be backed by law, documentation, and unassailable proof, a lesson I had spent months preparing to teach. In the following days, I noticed an even subtler shift. Karen began to hesitate before driving the easement. She altered her routes, slowed her approach, and frequently paused, measuring distances as if expecting another tow. Her posture and mannerisms conveyed caution tinged with panic. I did not provoke her. I allowed her behavior to evolve naturally, understanding that self-inflicted constraints are often the most effective form of control. The neighborhood continued to watch, fascinated by the slow unraveling of someone who had once wielded power unchecked. Some residents began discussing my actions openly, praising my restraint, clarity, and adherence to law, contrasting it with Karen's erratic and increasingly desperate maneuvers. It was an odd satisfaction to see that the story had shifted entirely. Karen had become the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when ego exceeds understanding, when control is assumed without legitimacy. Despite the apparent calm, I knew the next phase was approaching. Karen's desperation, combined with her relentless obsession, guaranteed that she would attempt one more major escalation. She had nothing to lose and everything to prove. I, in contrast, had carefully built a position of strength, anticipation, and readiness. By reinforcing legal authority and documenting every action, I had ensured that any escalation would unfold on terms favorable to me. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I walked along the edge of the easement, inspecting the signs, cameras, and boundary markers. Everything was in place, each element serving a purpose in the broader strategy. The air was filled with the quiet tension of the calm before the storm. Karen's shadow loomed somewhere beyond my line of sight, plotting, scheming, and waiting for an opportunity that would inevitably end in failure. And I waited too, but with patience, planning, and the confidence that comes from knowing the law is on your side. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. I could sense the next chapter of this suburban war building like a storm just beyond the horizon, ready to break with intensity, strategy, and consequences that would leave no doubt as to who held authority. Karen had forced the HOA to ban my trucks, challenged my rights, and underestimated the strength of careful, lawful preparation. She believed she could manipulate chaos into her favor, but the rules of property and legal authority were immutable. And as I turned back toward my home, trucks gleaming quietly in the fading light, I knew that the confrontation looming ahead would test every measure I had put into place. It would be decisive, dramatic, and unforgettable, a chapter that promised not only vindication, but the ultimate demonstration of why planning, patience, and legality always outmatch ego, tantrums, and unchecked ambition. The night settled over the neighborhood with an uneasy hush, and somewhere down the street, Karen's plotting mind spun tirelessly, unaware that her every move was already anticipated, her every escalation meticulously accounted for, and her position weaker than ever before. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a stillness that was almost unnerving. The streets of the neighborhood were quiet, the air heavy with anticipation, as if the entire cul-de-sac had collectively held its breath. Karen, however, did not exhibit calm or patience. Her fury, barely contained for weeks, had evolved into a single-minded determination. I could see her pacing behind her windows, glaring at the trucks parked legally in my driveway, the very trucks that had been the spark of this ongoing saga. She was plotting, scheming, and calculating her next move, convinced that she could somehow reclaim the power she had so publicly lost. But I had spent months preparing for this exact moment, and unlike her, I had no need to rely on emotion or impulsive decisions. My strategy was methodical, precise, and legally unassailable. I had anticipated her desperation and ensured that every potential move she could make was either countered or rendered irrelevant by law, documentation, and planning. That morning, I reviewed the final arrangements one last time. Security cameras were positioned for maximum coverage of the easement and surrounding areas. The towing company was on alert for any unauthorized vehicles, and the signs along the road were clear, conspicuous, and legally enforceable. Every detail had been addressed to prevent ambiguity, and every step was coordinated to ensure that Karen could not exploit any loophole. She, of course, believed herself clever. That morning, she approached the easement with a new plan, this time attempting to assert dominance by parking a large, rented moving truck partially across the access strip. Her idea was clear: create a blockade, intimidate anyone who tried to enforce rules, and force the HOA to intervene on her behalf. What she did not anticipate was the efficiency and legality with which I had orchestrated my response. I called the towing company preemptively, providing documentation of the blockage, photographic evidence of her truck violating the easement, and instructions for immediate removal. Within minutes, the operators arrived, moving with calm precision. The truck was lifted carefully, chains clinking, hydraulic lifts humming, and within moments Karen's barrier was gone. She emerged from her car, face pale with shock and rage, realizing that her bold move had been neutralized almost instantly. Her eyes darted around, searching for allies, witnesses, or loopholes she could exploit, but there were none. Every action she attempted was anticipated, every legal argument preemptively addressed, and every neighbor's gaze quietly reinforcing her defeat. The psychological impact was immediate. Karen, who had once commanded attention with shrill proclamations and aggressive tactics, now appeared small, almost frantic. She attempted to shout, to argue, to assert some imagined authority, but her words bounced off reality, empty and ineffective. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the culmination of patience, documentation, and strategy. I did not confront her directly. I did not escalate verbally. I remained calm, collected, and observant, letting the law, the towing operators, and the visible evidence speak on my behalf. The neighborhood watched, riveted by the unfolding drama. Some residents filmed discreetly, some whispered in astonishment, and some quietly applauded the clarity and order of enforcement. Karen's attempts to manipulate perception had failed. Her credibility, once inflated by self-assurance and vocal insistence, had eroded completely under the weight of indisputable legality. As the day progressed, she retreated to her property, pacing, muttering, and plotting. But the next escalation was already underway. Knowing Karen's obsession with control, I anticipated that she would attempt to manipulate or intimidate neighbors to her side. She circulated false claims about harassment, intimidation, and supposed illegal activity, attempting to paint me as the aggressor. Yet each claim was met with factual evidence, photographic records, and documented notices that demonstrated the exact opposite. Neighbors began to quietly confront her, questioning her narrative and subtly reinforcing my legal position. It was fascinating to observe the shift in influence. Karen, who had once dominated the neighborhood through assertiveness and vocal authority, now found herself isolated. Her words carried less weight. Her actions were scrutinized. Her credibility waned with each failed attempt to regain control. The tension in the neighborhood reached a peak that evening when she attempted her boldest move yet. She tried to physically block my driveway with a combination of her vehicles, strategically parked to create the illusion of obstruction. Her intent was clear: provoke a confrontation, create a legal ambiguity, and force the HOA or authorities to intervene on her behalf. What she failed to account for was the meticulous planning I had executed over the previous weeks. Cameras recorded every angle, tow notifications were already pre-authorized, and legal documentation left no room for misinterpretation. Within moments, the towing company arrived. Vehicles were removed with calm efficiency. Karen's elaborate attempt to regain dominance dissolved into chaos as neighbors watched the spectacle unfold. Her frustration was palpable. Her shouting was frantic. Her authority, once absolute in her mind, had been shattered completely. And yet, the final phase of the confrontation was not merely about removing vehicles or asserting rights. It was about demonstrating control and principle without escalating into petty conflict. I maintained composure, documenting every action, ensuring that everything remained within legal boundaries, and letting the visual evidence speak for itself. By the end of the day, Karen had retreated into her home, visibly defeated, plotting endlessly while the neighborhood absorbed the lesson. Legality, preparation, and calm authority outweigh aggression, manipulation, and unchecked ego. In the aftermath, I began consolidating my position further. Signs were reinforced, camera systems upgraded, and procedures for enforcement made even more precise. Every potential escalation was anticipated. Every legal measure double-checked. Karen, meanwhile, continued to spiral. Her attempts to leverage HOA influence, media attention, or sympathetic neighbors faltered repeatedly. Each failure compounded her frustration and humiliation, leaving her increasingly isolated and desperate. The neighborhood, meanwhile, adjusted to the new equilibrium. Conversations shifted subtly. Neighbors acknowledged the clarity and fairness of my actions. Karen, once a figure of authority and intimidation, became a cautionary tale, a study in how ego and aggression falter when faced with law, preparation, and calm determination. By nightfall, the cul-de-sac was quiet again, though tension lingered in the air. Karen's plotting mind continued to churn, aware that defeat was near but unwilling to accept it. I, however, stood firm, trucks gleaming in the driveway, signs visible and unambiguous, cameras recording every angle, and legal documentation unassailable. The stage was set for the final resolution. Karen had forced the HOA to ban my trucks. She had attempted repeated acts of defiance, manipulation, and intimidation. And yet, through careful planning, preparation, and adherence to the law, I had not only preserved my rights, but also demonstrated the consequences of unchecked aggression and the power of principle executed decisively. As I observed the quiet streets, I understood that the story was far from over. Karen's desperation would likely continue, but her options were dwindling, her credibility eroded, and her influence shattered. The battle had entered its final phase, and I was ready. The trucks, the signs, and the legal foundation were more than just tools. They were symbols of authority, preparation, and the ultimate vindication of patience and principle. The night fell over the neighborhood, calm but tense, a prelude to the climactic actions that would determine the final balance of power. Karen's plotting, my readiness, and the neighborhood's attention set the stage for an inevitable showdown. The stakes had never been higher, and the resolution promised to be dramatic, decisive, and unforgettable, a definitive end to the saga that had begun with nothing more than a disagreement over trucks. And as I walked back to my home, reviewing every detail, anticipating every move, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that the law, preparation, and patience would prevail over ego, tantrums, and unchecked ambition. The neighborhood might never look at trucks or Karen the same way again. The days following the fifth escalation settled into a tense rhythm. Karen, frustrated beyond measure, began to exhaust her usual arsenal of tactics. She had shouted, she had filed complaints, she had attempted blockades and false claims, and each time her efforts had been countered with calm precision and undeniable legality. Yet her obsession only grew. The neighborhood could feel it, even without seeing the specifics of her plotting. There was an edge in the air, a quiet tension that hummed beneath the surface of manicured lawns and white picket fences. It was clear that Karen was preparing for one final desperate attempt to regain control. I, of course, anticipated this. Months of careful preparation, legal documentation, and strategic planning had built a framework that could withstand her most audacious maneuvers. I reviewed every easement map, double-checked property boundaries, and ensured that the towing company, security systems, and signage were fully operational. Every potential loophole she could exploit had been accounted for. It was not paranoia, it was preparation. Karen's first sign of escalation came early one morning, when a neighbor called to report that she had been seen measuring the easement with a tape measure, sketching diagrams, and muttering calculations under her breath. She had begun to study the legal documents and property records she had acquired, attempting to find a flaw, a technicality, anything that could be twisted into leverage. What she didn't realize was that every document she scrutinized had been reviewed by attorneys, each line vetted for enforceability and accuracy. Her obsessive attention to detail would not save her. It would only delay the inevitable. Later that day, I watched from my window as she attempted to rally a small group of neighbors. She presented her carefully crafted diagrams, attempting to argue that my signage and enforcement were somehow illegal or overreaching. Her words were precise, her tone urgent, but the neighborhood's response was muted. The residents she hoped to sway were hesitant, skeptical, or quietly aligned with the legal reality I had established. Karen's charisma, once sufficient to dominate meetings and intimidate homeowners, had faltered under the weight of indisputable facts. That afternoon, she took her campaign to the next level. She drove her car slowly along the easement, stopping at intervals to take photographs and videos, intending to create a dossier of evidence she could present to the HOA, city officials, or even law enforcement. Her actions were deliberate, staged, and calculated, but they played directly into my advantage. The cameras I had installed recorded her every movement. Her patterns, her timing, her photographs, all were captured in clear, verifiable footage that would leave no room for dispute. Later, I received an anonymous note slid under my door, intended to intimidate me. It warned that if I continued my illegal towing and signage, there would be repercussions. I did not react emotionally. Instead, I documented it, photographed it, and stored it in the same secure files that contained all previous incidents. Each attempt at intimidation was absorbed, cataloged, and neutralized by preparation. That evening, she tried a new tactic, a direct confrontation. Karen approached the edge of the easement, demanding to speak with me, her voice sharp and trembling with barely contained fury. She shouted accusations, false claims, and a torrent of self-righteous indignation. I did not respond verbally. I did not escalate. I remained calm, standing a safe distance away, ensuring that every moment of interaction was recorded by the cameras and witnesses. Her fury, now combined with frustration and humiliation, made her increasingly erratic. Her gestures grew wild, her words overlapping in a frantic cascade. Neighbors who had gathered discreetly observed silently, some filming, some whispering in disbelief at her complete loss of composure. By nightfall, Karen's exhaustion and anger were evident. She had expended immense energy plotting, documenting, and confronting, yet the result remained unchanged. My authority over the easement was absolute, legally enforceable, and publicly visible. The neighborhood, too, began to internalize the shift in power. Conversations shifted from speculation about her complaints to admiration for the precision, calm, and lawfulness of my enforcement. Karen's influence, once dominant, had become a cautionary tale, a study in what happens when ego, anger, and manipulation meet preparation, legality, and patience. The next morning, Karen escalated again, this time attempting what she likely believed would be the final and decisive act, blocking the easement entirely with a rental truck and large debris containers. She coordinated her placement with precision, intending to create a legal quandary, provoke an emotional response, and force the HOA or authorities to intervene on her behalf. I observed from my porch, calm and deliberate. Everything had been anticipated. I contacted the towing company with the pre-approved documentation, ensuring that they had photographic evidence and legal verification of the easement and signage. Within minutes, the vehicles and obstacles were removed, each step executed with professional efficiency. Karen's face, as she realized her elaborate plan had failed before it truly began, was a mixture of disbelief and seething rage. She shouted, waved, and gesticulated wildly, but her actions were impotent against the legal framework and preparation I had orchestrated. The spectators, neighbors, casual onlookers, and even passers-by watched in quiet astonishment. The lesson was clear. The law, executed with preparation and precision, is far more powerful than anger, manipulation, or aggression. After the removal of the blockade, Karen retreated to her property, pacing and plotting furiously. Her desperation was visible in every hurried movement, every muttered calculation, every attempt to craft new strategies that could somehow regain her lost dominance. The neighborhood, however, had begun to shift subtly. Neighbors who had once feared her influence now spoke quietly among themselves, acknowledging the fairness, restraint, and authority of my actions. Some approached me privately, offering support or expressing admiration for the clarity and decisiveness with which I had handled the entire conflict. Karen's attempts to sway or intimidate had failed repeatedly, and her credibility was eroding with every failed escalation. By midweek, she had taken her efforts online, posting in neighborhood forums and social media groups with accusations, misrepresentations, and emotional appeals intended to garner sympathy. Her narrative was carefully crafted, aiming to recast herself as a victim of harassment and overreach. Yet the facts, already documented and widely known within the community, rendered her claims ineffective. Residents who had once entertained doubt now quietly dismissed her attempts to manipulate perception. The balance of power, once firmly in her hands through intimidation and assertiveness, had shifted irrevocably. Karen's next maneuver was a subtle psychological tactic. She attempted to provoke me indirectly, parking her car near the edge of the easement and staring toward my property, leaving notes on the windshield and making sure her movements were visible to the cameras. Her hope was to elicit a reactive response, an emotional display that could be framed as harassment. I did not react. Calm, deliberate, and fully within legal boundaries, I allowed the cameras to document every action. My non-response contrasted sharply with her erratic behavior, reinforcing the narrative of legality, authority, and measured control. By the weekend, the neighborhood was buzzing quietly with the spectacle of her descent. Conversations about HOA compliance, truck bans, and neighborhood aesthetics were now overlaid with discussions of strategy, legality, and the remarkable precision of my enforcement. Karen had become a study in desperation and the consequences of unchecked ego. Final escalation loomed like a storm on the horizon. I anticipated her last attempt would combine desperation, spectacle, and calculated risk. It would be dramatic, public, and likely intended to shame or intimidate. I was ready, every element of preparation, the towing company, signage, cameras, and documentation, was in place. The neighborhood had witnessed the mounting tension and understood the stakes. Karen, however, seemed oblivious to the fact that her efforts had left her isolated, visible, and legally powerless. That night, I walked the easement, inspecting the boundary markers, reviewing camera angles, and confirming that every sign was clear, legible, and legally enforceable. The trucks rested peacefully in the driveway, gleaming in the streetlights, symbols of preparation and persistence. Somewhere nearby, Karen was plotting, aware that her options were dwindling, but unwilling to concede. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation. The next chapter promised the climax of months of tension, legal maneuvering, and psychological warfare, a showdown that would finally determine the balance of power in the neighborhood, settle the conflict once and for all, and demonstrate the power of strategy, preparation, and calm authority. Over anger, ego, and manipulation, Karen's obsession, my readiness, and the neighborhood's attention combined to create a perfect storm, and I stood prepared to execute the final moves with precision, legality, and unyielding calm. The night settled over the cul-de-sac with an uneasy quiet, a pause before the inevitable, a tension that hummed in the air and promised that the resolution of this saga would be decisive, unforgettable, and absolute. The morning sun rose over the neighborhood with an unusual sense of anticipation. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual, as if aware that something monumental was about to unfold. I, of course, was fully prepared. Months of careful planning, legal documentation, and strategic enforcement had led to this point. Karen, meanwhile, was a storm barely contained, pacing her property like a caged animal, muttering to herself and gesturing wildly at the trucks parked legally in my driveway. She was desperate, aware that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly, yet unwilling to accept it. That morning, I observed her approach the easement with deliberate calculation. Her plan was clear: a final dramatic attempt to assert control and reclaim some semblance of authority. She had parked her car partially on the easement, alongside a small trailer loaded with personal items, creating the illusion of obstruction. Her hope was that the visual spectacle, combined with the potential for confrontation, would intimidate me and draw attention from neighbors or the HOA. I did not react emotionally. Calmly, I retrieved the final documents confirming my rights over the easement, checked the signage, and ensured the towing company was on stand, with all approvals and evidence fully documented. Every detail had been anticipated, every action pre-planned. Karen, oblivious to the precision of my preparation, began pacing, waving, and shouting accusations. She called neighbors over, attempting to rally support, but the response was muted. Many observed quietly from their homes, cameras discreetly capturing the drama, while others whispered among themselves, already recognizing the futility of her efforts. The towing company arrived within minutes, operating with professional efficiency. Chains clinked, hydraulics hummed in Karen's vehicles. The car and the trailer were lifted carefully and removed from the easement. The process was silent, methodical, and utterly legal. Karen's reaction, however, was anything but silent or methodical. She shouted, gestured wildly, and attempted to physically intervene, but her actions were documented in real time by cameras and witnesses. Each gesture, each word, each act of defiance was recorded, creating a comprehensive record of her escalating desperation and irrational behavior. Neighbors emerged quietly, some filming, some observing with wide-eyed fascination. Karen's narrative of victimhood, carefully constructed over months, began to unravel in plain sight. Her credibility, already diminished, disintegrated completely as her frantic energy contrasted sharply with the calm precision of the towing operation. By mid-morning, the neighborhood had absorbed the full impact of the event. Conversations shifted from whispered speculation to open acknowledgement. The law, preparation, and measured authority had triumphed over ego, aggression, and manipulation. Karen retreated to her home, pacing and muttering. Her energy now focused solely on devising a new strategy, any strategy, to reclaim lost control. Over the next few days, she attempted more subtle forms of retaliation. Anonymous letters, passive-aggressive notes, and online posts aimed at discrediting me or inciting neighbors circulated quietly. Each attempt was met with calm documentation, legal verification, and transparency. Security footage, photographs of signage, and records of towing and notifications neutralized every claim. Neighbors, increasingly aware of the pattern, began to recognize the futility of siding with her. Karen's influence eroded further with every failed maneuver. Midweek brought a new escalation. Karen attempted to obstruct the easement with landscaping materials, stacking mulch, planters, and decorative rocks to create a visual blockade. Her hope was that the physical presence would provoke confrontation or force me to act impulsively. I observed from my porch, composed and deliberate. The towing company had been notified, legal documentation was ready, and cameras recorded every angle. Within moments, the obstruction was removed efficiently and legally. Karen, realizing her latest plan had failed, stood in disbelief. Her hands trembled, her face flushed with frustration, and her shouting echoed through the quiet streets. This repeated pattern, her aggressive escalation, my calm and methodical response, had become a cycle she could no longer control or influence. By the weekend, she attempted one final gambit. She arranged for a small group of neighbors to gather at the easement, hoping to intimidate me through sheer presence and peer pressure. She delivered a speech filled with accusations, manipulations, and emotional appeals, attempting to sway opinion against me. The audience, however, had grown cautious. Some observed quietly from a distance, some whispered among themselves, and a few had already aligned with my position after witnessing months of calm enforcement backed by undeniable legality. I did not respond directly. Instead, I allowed the situation to unfold naturally, knowing that my preparation, documentation, and calm demeanor were far more powerful than any attempt at intimidation. The towing company remained on standby, ready to remove any unauthorized vehicles, while cameras recorded the gathering from multiple angles. Karen's frustration became almost tangible. She attempted to escalate verbally, shout threats, and provoke confrontation, but each act only reinforced the clarity and legitimacy of my authority. Neighbors quietly questioned her claims, whispered corrections to one another, and observed the legality of my actions firsthand. The psychological shift in the neighborhood was profound. Karen, once a dominant force, now appeared isolated, desperate, and irrational. Her attempts at manipulation and intimidation were powerless against the weight of documentation, preparation, and calm authority. The final moment of the chapter arrived late in the afternoon. Karen attempted to block the easement one last time with a combination of vehicles and materials, hoping to create chaos, force an emotional response, and manipulate perception. I observed from a distance, fully aware of the legal and logistical parameters in place. The towing company, cameras, and documentation ensured that her actions could be addressed swiftly and decisively. Within minutes, her vehicles and materials were removed, executed with the same calm, professional efficiency that had characterized every previous intervention. Karen's reaction was explosive but futile. She shouted, gestured wildly, and attempted to rally support, but the neighborhood had already absorbed the lesson. Her tactics were ineffective, her influence diminished, and her credibility destroyed. By evening, she had retreated to her property, pacing and muttering in frustration. The psychological and social consequences of her actions had reached a tipping point. Neighbors, previously wary of involvement, now quietly acknowledged the clarity, restraint, and authority with which I had acted. Karen's repeated failures and the transparent legality of my enforcement had shifted the balance irrevocably. The neighborhood, once dominated by her ego and aggressiveness, had come to recognize the power of preparation, legal authority, and measured action. Karen's obsession, fueled by frustration and humiliation, had left her isolated and powerless. She continued to plot, but each attempt at escalation was anticipated, neutralized, and documented. The trucks, signs, and towing procedures stood as visible, unassailable symbols of authority and principle. By nightfall, the street settled into a tense calm. Karen's plotting continued behind closed doors, her energy spent on increasingly desperate attempts at manipulation. The neighborhood absorbed the spectacle of her decline, the quiet authority of lawful enforcement, and the contrast between ego-driven aggression and calculated, measured action. As I stood on my porch, observing the quiet streets, I reflected on the months of escalation, preparation, and legal maneuvering. The ultimate showdown had been executed with precision, demonstrating that careful planning, documentation, and adherence to law outweigh anger, manipulation, and unchecked ambition. Karen's reign of intimidation and control had been dismantled systematically. Her every attempt at escalation anticipated and neutralized. The neighborhood had witnessed the power of law and preparation, the efficacy of calm authority over ego, and the consequences of obsession unchecked by reason. The stage was now set for the final resolution. Karen's desperation would continue, but her options were diminishing rapidly. Her credibility was shattered, her influence eroded, and the neighborhood's perception had shifted permanently. I remained calm, fully prepared for any further escalation, confident in the legal framework and documentation that had consistently reinforced my position. The trucks, the signage, and the towing procedures symbolized not just enforcement, but the unassailable authority that comes from preparation, legality, and restraint. The neighborhood had learned a lesson in power, consequence, and principle, and Karen had learned that unchecked ego and aggression cannot triumph over careful planning and lawful authority. The night fell with a tense quiet, signaling the imminent conclusion of this saga, a climax in which preparation, patience, and legal authority would finally deliver the resolution, establishing a permanent balance of power and a definitive lesson in the consequences of overreach. The final chapter of this suburban saga began under the faint pink glow of dawn, the streets eerily quiet as if holding their breath for the culmination of weeks of tension, plotting, and escalating drama. Karen, of course, did not embrace calm or reflection. Her energy had become a singular, frantic force, concentrated entirely on regaining control, proving her dominance, and rewriting a narrative that had long been destroyed. I, in contrast, had spent months preparing for this exact scenario, anticipating every potential escalation, and fortifying every legal, logistical, and strategic advantage I could muster. The easement was clearly marked, signage conspicuous, cameras recording every possible angle, and the towing company on stand, by with pre-approved documentation for immediate action. Every detail was deliberate, every contingency accounted for. That morning, Karen approached the easement with the precision of someone who had plotted every movement in advance. Yet her demeanor betrayed a combination of desperation and obsession. She parked her car partially on the access strip, alongside a small trailer filled with materials intended to create a physical blockade. Her intent was obvious: provoke a confrontation, intimidate, and manipulate perception in her favor. I watched from a distance, calm and deliberate. There was no rush, no emotional reaction. Everything had been anticipated. Within minutes, the towing company arrived, operating with flawless efficiency. Chains clinked, hydraulic lifts hummed, and Karen's vehicles were removed carefully, each action fully documented and executed legally. Neighbors observed discreetly, some filming, some whispering among themselves, and some merely watching in quiet fascination. Karen's reaction was explosive. She shouted, gesticulated wildly, and attempted to intervene physically, but her actions were fully captured by cameras and witnesses. The evidence was clear. She was the aggressor, her tactics desperate, irrational, and ineffective. The psychological impact was immediate. Karen, once the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, now appeared frantic, disoriented, and powerless. Her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood dissolved in real time, leaving her credibility in ruins. Over the next few days, Karen's attempts at subtle retaliation grew increasingly erratic. Anonymous notes, online posts, and passive-aggressive gestures were cataloged, photographed, and stored. Each act of escalation was met with calm enforcement and clear documentation. The neighborhood, increasingly aware of the pattern, began to recognize the futility of siding with her. She had exhausted her influence, her strategies, and her credibility. Her obsession with control had left her isolated, vulnerable, and predictable. Then came the final maneuver, a culmination of months of escalating tension and repeated failures. Karen attempted to coordinate with the HOA, attempting to overturn the legality of the easement enforcement and the towing actions. She presented her case in meetings, submitted documents, and tried to leverage sympathetic neighbors. Yet every claim was easily countered. Legal documentation, signed easement agreements, photographic evidence, and records of towing notices all reinforced my position. The HOA, already weary from repeated conflicts and aware of the legal clarity, refused to intervene. Karen's plan collapsed under the weight of indisputable facts, leaving her more frustrated than ever. The psychological shift in the neighborhood was complete. Neighbors who had previously feared her wrath now observed with quiet admiration for the calm, measured, and legally grounded enforcement of my rights. Karen's once dominant energy was replaced with desperation and isolation. Her attempts to rally support, intimidate, or manipulate perception were ineffective. Every failed action, every public display of frustration, further eroded her credibility. It was clear that her obsession had become self-defeating. As the days progressed, Karen's behavior became more erratic. She paced her property, muttered calculations and strategies under her breath, and attempted minor acts of obstruction or intimidation that were neutralized almost immediately through preparation and legal enforcement. Her energy, once a source of intimidation, now served only to highlight the inevitability of her defeat. By midweek, she attempted a final public demonstration. She parked her car and a small trailer on the easement during the busiest part of the day, intending to provoke neighbors into confrontation, create a spectacle, and force emotional reactions. I observed calmly, allowing her actions to unfold within the framework I had established. The towing company responded within minutes, and her vehicles were removed with professional efficiency, Cameras captured every angle, neighbors observed discreetly, and the legal and procedural clarity left no room for her narrative of victimhood. Karen's reaction was a mixture of rage, disbelief, and panic. Her shouting, gestures, and frantic attempts to manipulate perception only served to confirm her desperation to the neighborhood. The psychological and social consequences of her repeated failures were profound. Residents who had once hesitated now quietly affirmed the legitimacy and fairness of my actions. Karen's influence, already diminished, reached its nadir. She became a cautionary example of what happens when ego, aggression, and obsession confront preparation, legality, and patience. Over the next week, Karen's activity shifted from public spectacle to private plotting. She attempted to manipulate neighbors subtly, spread misinformation online, and create narratives designed to tarnish my reputation. Every attempt was anticipated, countered, and documented. Her credibility eroded further with each failed maneuver. Neighbors increasingly recognized the pattern. Karen's aggression was futile, predictable, and legally impotent. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to regain its equilibrium. Conversations shifted from speculation about trucks and blockades to admiration for the clarity, precision, and calm authority with which I had conducted enforcement. Residents appreciated the transparency, documentation, and adherence to law that had consistently neutralized her tactics. The final escalation came unexpectedly. Karen attempted to physically block the easement with a large rental truck and decorative landscaping materials, intending to provoke confrontation and assert dominance. I observed from my porch, composed and deliberate. The towing company, fully briefed, arrived swiftly. Chains lifted the truck and materials with professional efficiency. Cameras captured every angle, ensuring indisputable documentation. Karen's reaction was explosive but futile. Shouting, gesturing, and attempting to physically interfere, she demonstrated her desperation in full view of the neighborhood. Her credibility, once inflated by assertiveness and vocal authority, was shattered completely. At this point, the neighborhood had fully absorbed the lesson. Karen, formerly a figure of intimidation, had become a study in desperation and the consequences of unchecked ego. Her every attempt at manipulation and escalation had been anticipated, neutralized, and documented. The balance of power was now unassailable. The final resolution, both psychological and legal, was clear. Karen had been out-maneuvered at every turn, her credibility destroyed, and her influence nullified. The trucks, the signs, and the towing procedures remained symbols of lawful authority, preparation, and measured enforcement. The neighborhood had witnessed the ultimate triumph of preparation, legality, and patience over anger, ego, and obsession. Karen, exhausted, frustrated, and defeated, retreated to her home. Her plotting, once relentless, was now limited to private muttering and hopeless strategizing. Neighbors, meanwhile, observed quietly, understanding that the conflict had reached a permanent resolution. The law, clear documentation, and calm authority had prevailed. As night fell over the cul-de-sac, the streets quiet, and the trucks resting peacefully, it was evident that the saga had reached its conclusion. Karen's relentless attempts to control, manipulate, and intimidate had been systematically dismantled. The neighborhood had witnessed the power of preparation, legal clarity, and measured action. Ego, aggression, and obsession could not triumph against patience, documentation, and lawful authority. Standing on my porch, observing the quiet streets, I felt the satisfaction of finality. Karen's reign of intimidation and control had been dismantled. The trucks, signs, and towing procedures remained, symbols of the ultimate lesson. Legality, preparation, and calm authority prevail where anger, manipulation, and unchecked ambition fail. The cul-de-sac, once a stage for chaos and confrontation, settled into a permanent equilibrium. Neighbors, previously caught between competing narratives, understood clearly the consequences of overreach and the value of lawful enforcement. Karen's legacy became one of caution, a vivid example of the limits of aggression when faced with meticulous preparation and unassailable authority. The saga that began with complaints about trucks and escalated through blockades, threats, and repeated confrontations had reached its inevitable conclusion. The story had demonstrated the power of patience, planning, and legality over emotional impulsivity, ego-driven aggression, and obsession. As I walked along the easement one last time, inspecting signage, cameras, and boundaries, I recognized that the neighborhood had absorbed the lessons of months of conflict. Karen, defeated and isolated, was a silent testament to the consequences of unchecked ambition and relentless ego. The trucks rested peacefully, the signs remained visible and clear, and the towing procedures ensured continued lawful control. The neighborhood, once a stage for chaos and intimidation, had achieved clarity, fairness, and balance. The story, complete in every sense, had delivered a powerful lesson that preparation, legality, and measured action are the ultimate tools in conflicts fueled by ego, aggression, and manipulation. Karen's defeat was absolute. Her influence gone, her credibility destroyed, and her obsession rendered futile. The neighborhood, calm and restored, had witnessed the full arc of the conflict, and the lessons would linger long after the streets returned to normal. And as the night settled fully over the cul-de-sac, the saga closed with a final, quiet certainty. Authority grounded in law and preparation always triumphs over ego, aggression, and unchecked obsession. The story had come full circle, from the first truck complaint to the ultimate resolution, and the neighborhood would remember the lessons learned for years to come.